So welcome to another edition of the Secure Dynamics TechCast. With me, I have a past guest and a good friend and a co-author, Krishnan Podnar. Welcome.
Hey, how are ya? It's good to
I'm
see
doing
you.
well. Good to see you too. So, Krishna, you and I were chatting about what to talk about over here, and I think the topic that you talked about data localization and the fragmentation of the internet. So, I want to quickly do a quick, maybe 30, 45-second walk through the internet timeline, right? So, it started off as, hey, it's DARPA, and we're going to kind of set this thing up. Usenet. I just looked up Usenet. It's still apparently. So it was a very democratized anybody to anybody connection. And then I think, what was it, late 90s, early 2000s, AOL, Yahoo, so these big kingdoms, if you will. So the walled garden, I don't think anyone talks about it anymore, happened. And then from there on, the big seven of the world, right? So the Ali, Tencent, Baidu, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, and who am I missing? Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon,
Twitter,
Microsoft, right?
and Microsoft.
Yeah. So those seven, and then so those I don't know hub economies, if you will, happen. But now the point that you brought up, which I found really interesting, is now you have these localized boundaries, whether it's TikTok and what they're allowed to do with ByteDance, and whether it's Twitter. So far, no. But again, there's obviously going to be retaliation. So how does that affect? I mean, I know you talk to a lot of CMOs and CIOs. How do you go attracting, or do you now have to advertise or be relevant on Insta and TikTok and Twitter, or is there a different way to engage?
Yeah, so I just, I love this question. I love the fact that we're having this conversation because I think you're right. We sort of went to this conglomerates and sort of these big kind of entities. But I think what's been happening is a little bit of an undercurrent, right? We actually saw Russia in the late, 2009, 2010 timeframe start to do more data localization requirements. China, of course, has done localization as well, but we started to see an undercurrent of localization, and that continued into EU's GDPR. And I think it's important to note that because what we've been seeing in terms of TikTok and the backlash against TikTok, which by the way is fascinating, right? Because it's the United States saying like, hey, we don't want US citizen data being taken by Chinese government. And I'm sitting there going like, that's interesting. I wonder if the pot is calling the kettle black here, because the EU could turn to the United States and say the same thing around, Instagram and around Facebook, et cetera. But at the same time, I'm also thinking to myself, like, wow, this is fascinating in terms of who are we pointing the fingers towards, and the fact that the real issue, everybody says like, well, TikTok, personal data is being used. Most of that data has already been available on the dark web for years through data breaches. And so you're really seeing a continuation, in my opinion, of this politicization, of the balkanization of the internet, rather than some really, really big thing that all of a sudden happened, right? So this isn't sort of like a poof, starburst, splash. I sort of feel like things have been building up. If you've been watching and listening, things have been building up to this point. And now what's happening is it's just becoming more mainstream. And I think you're right. If you're a CMO or even if you're a CIO, it's like, what should you be thinking? Like, do you set up different data stores in different countries and different regions? If you're a CMO, do you need to be on every platform in order to brand yourself? And then what are the risks and what are the opportunities of doing that, right? Because if you're on TikTok, is there negative sentiment? Or even with this latest executive order, if you're a CMO, the question I've been getting is, should we just jump off the platform, right? And just call it a day? And I'm like, okay, whoa, like, don't jump off just yet, because even with the executive order, you still have TikTok that's installed on millions of devices. And what you really have is an opportunity to continue to interact with that audience for probably years to come, right? Because they're not going to be able to necessarily upgrade their software if it's pulled out of the stores, but they will actually have the app on their device, and they can continue to interact with it for years to come. So that's number one. The other thing I think that's interesting is this is an opportunity for a lot of brands to reposition themselves. And, it's interesting that we've had this like knee-jerk reaction by the United States to ban potentially like TikTok, because what it's doing really is it's allowing TikTok to stay in countries and regions like the EU. So for CMOs and for brands that are based in the EU, they're actually going to get competitive advantage potentially out of this compared to the US brands, because so many people are flocking to TikTok the EU population is not going to jump off of the platform. And so all of a sudden, even though you're concerned maybe from a US perspective of what to do, you have to remember that there are other worlds that you need to be present in. And then longer term, you might want to adopt a strategy that says, let me start to diversify my platforms so I'm not as married to one and not as dependent on one, especially in these wars that are happening.
So it's interesting you mentioned diversification, because that was going to be my next question, which is, let's fast forward. Let's say I don't want to be tied to a Facebook or a Google alone, and I diversify. Doesn't that put a burden on the GDPR or CCPR, any kind of regulations about data collection, data classification, data hygiene in general? And if so, are CIOs and CISOs prepared, or chief privacy officers prepared for that additional level of investment and hygiene to be able to manage so many different platforms?
Absolutely not. I think what we're still seeing, or at least what I'm seeing a lot, is a spray and pray method, which is push stuff out there and hope it works. I think that this is kind of one of those moments where you might want to actually do a little bit of a sideways turn and say, look, I'm trying to kind of diversify my platforms. So what I'm going to do is actually use multiple platforms, but I'm not just going to push stuff out every place. I'm going to tactically look at who am I engaging, what do the users want, and look to have those one-on-one relationships, right? And in that context, I think the burden isn't as heavy on privacy officers. I don't think that organizations have an additional burden. I think it's another channel, but it's the same kind of information. It's the same kind of engagement. It's just a different medium. And so I think that there's not an additional burden there, but it isn't a burden, if you will, for the CMO. He needs to really kind of think through the strategy and the approach, and who are you engaging with, through what channel, and in some instances, how are you channeling different messages across channels, because you might have a user that's engaging through multiple feeds. Right. And so how do you actually make that conversation so that it's not this like, oh, I'm talking to you here on Twitter and over here I'm talking to you on Insta. It's like, I'm just talking to you, Ashwin, and we're having a great conversation and it's a wonderful one. And so I think that that's where we kind of get into this, omni-channel conversation. And I know that omni-channel has become like the buzzword of the day. But I do think that whether you call it omni-channel or communications, whatever you want to get at, I think that's really where CMOs and CIOs have to go in partnership, as you pointed out, with chief privacy officers.
So one last question, and this is something that we talked about last time we connected also. Where do data brokers stand in all of this? I know we talked about last time about being transparent about how data was acquired, but in this world where Cambridge Analytica has probably gone no longer muscle memory for many people, but the name keeps coming up. But what have we learned from that? And in this new world where we talked about these localization and fragmentation of the internet, are data brokers in a much stronger position than ever before? And number one. Number two is, who are the customers for the data brokers going forward?
So I actually don't see that data brokers are as big of a deal for large brands, especially. I see large brands actually stepping away from brokers and looking for first-party trust data, mostly because that's where you have the traceability, you have the security, and from a reputational perspective, that means a lot, right? First things always is like do no harm. Brand safety has to come first. And so I see data brokers, especially like the big Googles, having less of an influence. And I see more brands engaging one-on-one and looking for first-party data. I also see them stepping away, which is interesting during this COVID time. And right after COVID, or as COVID started, through the Black Lives Matter effort as well, what I've seen is brands stepping away from the really large platforms and instead looking to do more of that individual engagement, even if the numbers are down, which I think is a fascinating turn, right? Really large brands are seeing the numbers drop, which normally makes, executives and board of directors nervous. So their numbers are slightly down, but they're still stepping back and they're looking to reshift the types of engagement. And they're really looking more at the quality rather than the quantity. And we're really talking about that personal, reputational kind of engagement over pricing and products. And so complete shift. And what's interesting to me is what caused that shift, right? We've been talking about it for years, and here we are. In 6 months, the world has really shifted quickly.
Very interesting. And I couldn't agree more. I think those things about, hey, top of funnel, it's like, hey, top of funnel is interesting, but then the impact of the 10 people versus the 100 we would have got otherwise. So
Exactly.
Very, very interesting.
I think it's really interesting. And I think that, for smart kind of leaders at this moment, this is the time to kind of take and ride that wave where they're going to take 2 customers that are really loyal to the brand over just 20 people knowing about them. Right. And it's like, you know what, I'm going to treasure that relationship. And it's an opportunity to grow that loyalty to the point where now what you have is 2 individuals who are going out there and they're evangelizing. They're actually becoming an ally for your brand. And that's, I think, the critical path, right? So data broker is becoming less relevant because we actually have those evangelists and we have those people who are actually advocating for the brand. And what's interesting at the same time is, social influencers, such a big thing in 2019 and even at the start of 2020, we're seeing that actually drop off, which I think is really, really interesting too.
Yeah. Very, very good conversation as expected. So Krishna, again, thanks for your time. Stay safe and talk to you next month.
Thanks, Ashwin. Same to you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.